All right, Michael Starch, oh man, I had it all prepared, I was ready. Flight software engineer at the one and only Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena.
Okay. So, with that, I'm not used to starting out the talk with claps, but okay. As Mary said, I'm Michael Starch. I'm a flight software engineer at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory here in Pasadena, California. And instead of starting off with a picture of me sitting at a desk, I decided to start off the picture with a giant rocket over my shoulder that has nothing to do with this talk or the work I do at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but it kind of fits the aerospace talk. I have been working in open source since I started my career at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in 2011, and I've been the F-Prime community manager since 2019. So I've been managing a real open source project that's out there. It came out of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and what we'll find in this talk is I really don't have any clue what I'm doing. But that's okay. That's one of the benefits of coming to scale is you don't have to have perfect insight into what you're doing. You have to be willing to share your steps so other people can get started too. Because maybe I've gotten a little bit of a head start and that will help you get going. What are we going to talk about today? So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to talk about F-Prime and what F-Prime is in the open source world. This is for people who haven't seen any of the number of other talks I've given at Scale about F-Prime because those were like 5 years ago. And this will give us an introduction as to the product we're using as an example to talk about open source management. Then we're going to ask the question, what is open management? So it's a term I coined, we'll get into that. We'll talk about the first steps on how you get that open source project up and running. Then we'll talk about community and the things that community bring. Then we'll talk a little bit about the advanced side of open management, how you get further in. We'll cover some takeaways, and then we'll talk a little bit about the future. If you're wondering what the takeaways from this talk are, they're right here. So I'll give you a moment. We're going to embrace community. We want to open source everything. We want to follow standard patterns, and we want to automate, automate, automate. I'm hoping that I'll get through this talk with enough time for questions because I think that's where the most useful discussion comes in, is at the end where you all have some chance to digest what we've talked about and ask questions, because that will help us all figure out what we can take away from this talk. So, what is F-Prime? F-Prime is an embedded systems framework. It's designed to write the control software that controls open source projects. I don't know if you noticed on the first screen, but there is that helicopter there. That's actually a picture of the Ingenuity helicopter. It's a helicopter that's flying on another planet right now. It was developed at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and it runs F-Prime. And that's about all we're going to get to in terms of Ingenuity today, but that gives you an idea of what F-Prime does. It allows you to control spacecraft, embedded systems, anything that might have a little computer in it that you want to control remotely. At Jet Propulsion Laboratory, we do a lot of deep space robotics, and that's kind of the field we're in. And we're going to use F-Prime as a way of exploring how to manage an open source project. F-Prime is a little bit unique in terms of open source projects because of something called ITAR. ITAR is a set of regulations that say if I hand the wrong information to somebody who isn't a US person, then I might get thrown in jail. I'm a little bit in jest there, but it's a very serious government regulation. And that's one of the things that F-Prime contends with, as well as all of the standard things that happen in the open source community. We're also in the field of aerospace, and aerospace isn't as far along as other fields in terms of embracing open source. And so you'll see some of that newness, some of that freshness that F-Prime brings to the open source world. F-Prime was open sourced in 2017. Before that, it was in internal research and development, and since then, we've been doing open development. We're currently on release 3.1, and it is now 2023. So, the next question we should ask is, what is open management? Because my talk constantly harps on the idea of open management. Well, open management is this. I intentionally used a spaghetti diagram. It's here to terrify this audience. It's the idea of pulling all of your management structures, whatever you use to develop your project, and dragging them into the open sphere. We want to talk about how to manage projects in the open, so that we're not managing with a shadow committee hiding behind closed doors, but we're letting the world see how we develop our product. They're not just seeing the open source, but they're seeing the open structure of how we build that open source. That is our goal. I was also told to say I'm a little bit biased. This is from people at JPL. I should say right now I am a member of the Apache Software Foundation, and they're all about doing everything as much as we can in the open. Publishing notes, publishing meeting agendas, having places where you can go that you can see how their community runs. And so I'm kind of big about the whole open management idea and getting as much of that in the open. I was told to say I'm biased because not every project needs to go that far, and we'll explore that through the rest of this talk. So let's talk about the first steps in open management. How do we get that project out there into the world, ready to be part of the open source? Here's some of the problems we're going to face in our first steps. How do we justify to our stakeholders that it's worth going open source, right? Most companies in the aerospace realm look at the idea of going open source and saying, oh my word, there goes our intellectual property marching out the door. How do you deal with that? Quickly thereafter, you'll run into what I call the open source existential crisis. That's the idea of, you're now an open source project, oh my gosh, how do we exist as open source? And then finally, this magic of inventing community. Community is the whole reason a lot of people want to go open source, but it's not something that you just pull out of a hat, despite this graphic illustrating that. It is something that you have to build and work with. The first thing you should do as you move to open source and start to work on those problems is figure out why you're going open source. What is the reason that you want to be in the open source world? I have a bunch of ideas here. You might want to get help, right? Help build something together. You might want to be a responsible citizen. You want to do what's right for the world. Lots of people at scale talk about open source because it's the right thing to do. You might want to build community. You might want to brag to your friends. This is a big one I see in aerospace. You might want to check a box that comes from some ethereal organization above your head. You might want to expand your product reach, or you might want to find testers. There are a number of people in this audience who test F prime for me. They don't know that they're doing that for me, but they do. Understanding these goals is important for going to open source because it helps guide your path. The second step on that path is figuring out how you're going to go open source. That is choosing an open management model. I've pulled up 3, I'm sure there are more. I'm speaking boldly at a Linux conference about 3 models to open source. There are plenty more. But the first is code drop. If your goal is to check a box, or maybe just make sure that somebody else can read your code, code drop might be the right management model for you. You just spit it out onto open source and you walk away. Spoiler alert, that's not what we're talking about in this particular presentation. But that's okay. We have to acknowledge that some organizations and some goals in the open source world do result in a code drop, and that's okay. As long as we're honest about it, that's better than just kind of dropping the code and trying to pretend we're doing something different. F prime started with that model, by the way. We kicked code out onto the internet. We let it sit there, and we pretended like we were a bigger project doing proper open management, but every 6 months we'd just drop new code out for our customers without informing them of anything. It was a source of tension. So if you're honest about it, code drop could be the right model, but it might not be the right model. Establishing those goals helps inform which path to choose. The next model I have is the Apache software model. Partnering with a foundation. Now, I keep talking about Apache, that's the one I'm experienced with, but Scale, I believe, is helped put on by the Linux Foundation, so maybe I should reference them more, but there are a lot of these foundations out there. Their goal is to build community and build open source. When you go to the Apache Software Foundation, the first thing they tell you is, you don't get to develop code for 3 to 6 months. What are we going to do? We're going to build community and build management structures instead. And most software engineers go, oh my word, really? And what comes out of it is a project that is ready to manage itself with the support from a foundation. So that might be something you want to choose. It comes with some costs. You're donating your code to somebody else. You're donating your management to a larger organization, and then you're agreeing to be part of that. But what comes out is training and building you up to form that community. We're also not going to talk too much about that model because F prime went to the manage your own model. That's trying to figure out your own way in open source. And this is where we can see a lot of the lessons learned and the experience coming in, because the foundation model has their way of answering these questions and just kind of gives it to you, and the code drop model doesn't care. So we're going to be focusing over here on managing your own to see how we can manage an open source and see where these lessons come from. The last thing you want to do once you've chosen your route in open source and understand your goals is you probably want to start building a community. Why would you push your code out onto the internet for everybody to see if you don't want some form of community? And so how do we build that community? It's all about nucleation. Right? You need to give your community a starting point. Just as a crystal is a nucleation point for the formation of a larger crystal, we need something out there in the community that helps that community get started. In the case of F Prime, it was documentation, examples, and support. We kicked out some documentation. We've always had some examples internal to JPL, and we pushed those out onto the internet and started there. That nucleation point brought in people because they said, aha, there's this thing that solves my needs and it has an example. I can play with that. And then they came around, and after a few years of playing with F Prime and helping us build our documentation, they started generating our support. So if you go onto the F Prime GitHub page, you'll see that there are people outside of JPL answering questions for me so that I don't have to answer those questions. Community becomes a self-building cycle. If you give the community what they need to start, they will repeat and repeat. Another thing that F Prime did that isn't clearly indicated on the slides is we also did a lot of, for lack of a better word, evangelism. We went out to groups that we know needed to be in the sphere of space and said, hey, F Prime might work for you. We talked to users, specifically at universities, and said, hey, we have this open source project. You've got this student team that doesn't have deep experience. Try leveraging our experience that's packaged in a nice box. And then they'd complain that there isn't enough documentation examples. We tried to fix that. We did get a little bit better, and those teams grew. So going out there and finding your target audience in the community and chatting with them directly is a good way to promote that. At this point, we've started in open source. We understand why we're there, we understand what we're doing, and we're starting to build that community. So, let's talk about open management and the community. Why do we want to talk specifically about community? Because community is a double-edged sword. Those pesky users are out there to confound you, to stop you, to tell you that you're managing this wrong. But also they come with good ideas and they help you bring your product to a larger audience. They form that feedback cycle. So what are some of the things that can confound us in the community sphere? Well, one is something I see in a lot of open source projects, which is community and product fragmentation. Somebody says, you're not quite meeting my needs, so I'm going to fork it and move on, right? It's open source. They can do that. It's a fantastic thing that you can do in open source, but it means your community is starting to fragment like that nice little critical mass model that I put on the screen there. The other thing is the community can get confused. What is this product about? Where is it going? How do I use it? And if they're helping you answer your support questions, that confusion can bleed in. And then finally, my favorite graphic that I've used on just about every presentation I've ever made, the thundering herd. At some point, you need to scale. Whether it's your computers that you need to scale out on the cloud or your community support, you have to understand scale. Where are you today? Where are you going? And how do you make sure that you have enough resources to accomplish that? And community, when we're managing open source projects, brings that point of scale to your attention. So we'll talk a little bit about the thundering herd. All right, so the first thing to do when you're working with the community in open source is accepting feedback. We talked about product fragmentation. Why do people fragment products? Because it's not meeting their needs, and they don't feel like it will ever meet their needs, so they take it and run with it. One of the big ways that you can make sure that your product is not fragmenting is to listen to your users. I don't fix everything the users want me to fix. I have 300 bug reports sitting out there that are unfixed because my team is not that large. But I hear the users, I respond to their bug reports, and I make sure we track their issues. I have yet to have a user fragment my product and come back and say, look, we did F Prime better, let's ship that out there. Because I am working very hard to make sure that I hear what their needs are, collect those needs, and make sure that they feel heard. If they feel heard, they can help build the product and they don't feel the need to clone it, own it, and run. Other things we can do is make sure that we're soliciting design opinions. right? F Prime is coming out of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. We like to believe we know how to design everything, but I still solicit design opinions from the world. Why? Because people's feedback is important. They don't feel like they need to fragment the product if they're contributing to the design, because then suddenly we're working together to build a better product than either of the institutions, either of the users could build together. Instead, they're working to build a product that we can both own. And then finally, I have questions and discussions. I make sure that people have a place to ask questions, start discussions, and contribute to the community. That builds a vibrant community that has a lot of thought space that people can engage in, and they don't feel like it's a dead product that they should take and run. Next, this is probably the biggest takeaway of the presentation: open source your management structures. We started with F Prime with all of our issue tracking, all of our design ideas, all of our development progress baked into JPL and hidden from the world. We did that code drop model and we pretended like we gave support, we had that documentation, but nobody ever knew what the direction of our product was or what issues we were contending with or already had reported, and had no way of contributing anything other than this doesn't work. This is important. If you open source your management structures, people can get on board with this idea. They're no longer confused about how the product is being developed, where it is going, and what they can do to contribute to it. By externalizing your issues and milestones, your development progress, all of your design discussions, the users can engage. They see the direction your product is taking, and they can extrapolate. They can join in. They can help you build that product. But if you don't do this, that issue of user confusion will bite you time and time again, because the larger set of your team that is external to your organization, that is the large community, will have no idea what you're doing. I don't want to pretend like F Prime has fully solved this problem. We are still struggling to get our management structures out, but we've started to get issues and milestones out, we've gotten our design discussions out, and that's helping a lot. Even that little bit has gotten our users to start engaging and feeling like they can contribute to a product without going in the wrong direction or without fighting us. And one of the things we'll see on the future slide is F Prime needs to continue to get better at this. Finally, you want to enable those users. This is the scariest part that F Prime has to contend with. We're JPL engineers. We know what we're doing. We want ownership over our product because we fly this thing in space. Why would you ever enable a user? But the thing is, you must enable your users. If you don't enable your users, they're not going to be able to provide that relief to that support problem. They're not going to have any idea what the product is doing, and they're just going to want to take it, break it off, and do their own thing. But by enabling users, you fix all three of those problems we talked about. They're no longer confused, they're helping you beat down that support problem, and they are keeping the development space on your version of the product and not theirs. So how can we enable users? Well, one, invest in user contributions. That thing on the left there is a pull request that I merged. It came from one of my users. I made sure that it came in. Why did I choose this one? I chose this one because I had already done that work and I just hadn't pushed the branch yet. The user got there first. Rather than saying, hey, you did something that I did and I don't want to review this because I've already done the work correctly, I said, I'm going to throw away my branch and take the users. Why? Because that makes them feel like they're contributing. They're empowered to contribute to my product. Even if I had to throw away my own work, I could invest a little bit more energy to make sure that those users could contribute. That empowers them. That gets them a feeling of, one, they've been able to resolve their issue, two, they're part of this community and part of this product development, and three, they are empowered to continue supporting the product. Two, elevate key members. This middle slide that you see here, that is a picture of one of our key members. This person does not work at JPL, but they're out there supporting our community time and time again. They have answers to questions that I don't have answers for because they took my product and applied it in a completely different way, and they're supporting half the community with the thoughts and contributions that come out of their adaptation. Not as a fragmentation point, but their way of using my product that is just different from anything we've had to do. This user has been a godsend to our project because they make sure that the community has support for things that I couldn't even conceive of. How did we get this user? This is one of the people we talked to at the beginning, and then when it was clear that they were going to use our product, we kept pushing. We said, hey, can you look at this? Hey, can you start posting back on our discussions? We elevated this user to make sure that they felt empowered to own parts of our conversation, and now they do. And then finally, letting the community lead. The community is going to try to lead no matter what you do. That's one of the downsides of open source, is you don't have full control over the product. There isn't a purse string that you can necessarily pull. So rather than fight community leadership, let them lead where they want to go. You can nudge them in a certain direction, but if you let them lead some of the development, let them talk about the key issues they want, then you remove this tension of you're trying to lead one way and they're trying to lead the other way. Instead, you're letting them lead and guiding them on a path that meets both of your goals. And that's important because that keeps the community from fighting with your management style, and instead they start to embrace your management style. So now we've talked a little bit about how to get into open source. We've talked about how to deal with the community. As pesky as they can also be very powerful for your product. Now we're going to talk about the advanced side of open management. Once you've figured out community and you're starting to get to that point of thundering herd, what can you do as advanced practices in the field? So what problems are we going to look at here? One, looking the part. How do you look like an open source project? At some point, that community that you've been pushing starts to form on its own, and then people you want to attract might not care as much about your product, but might be filtering through the open source space. They might be at an open source conference looking at your talk about open management. How do you encourage those people who have talents that might be outside your field to join in? Well, one way is looking the part. Two, how do you keep quality? This is a big one for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. We fly this on spacecraft. It must be of impeccable quality. But I just talked about the community guiding its development and contributing to the product. How do we do that? And then finally, how do we manage the multiverse? That is, users will use your product in ways you don't expect, many different ways you don't expect. You will start to use your product in a way that you don't expect, and suddenly your project looks like something different to each of these people, but we're still trying to prevent that fragmentation. So how do we manage that? All right, so let's jump in. One, follow standard patterns. This is one of the nicest things about working with GitHub as your open source project. They have a checklist that tells you how to do open source. It might be some of the basic things, but they have a checklist. If you see here, it breaks down into several categories. One, the top set, enabling use of the product. If you put in your description, you have a README, then you have people who can understand your product and know what to do with it. It's not just this blank slate, but somebody coming at it from an open source conference can read the README and get some idea of what it is. Two, it guides your open source development. Some of the things that trip me up, you can see them not checked on this board, is when we started to manage open source, people started asking about, well, how do I contribute? Do you have a contributor's guide? What is the code of conduct for working with your product? And the big one, what is your security policy and how do you deal with security problems? I work in embedded software that we launch off space. Typically, my answer to security is it's locked down by an interplanetary radioscope. That doesn't apply anymore because the world has matured to the point where lots of people have these telescopes, but it's a question that caught me off guard. And my users came in and said, hey, you need to deal with this. Following these standard patterns, the ones that my users are asking for, helps me do open source and answer questions that I didn't know I need to answer, like security, although I probably should have known that security was an issue, but still, you get the idea. It gives me a guide. And finally, it frames community interaction. Those last pieces down there at the bottom, how do you interact with the community? Issue templates, pull request templates, contributing guides. All of these things help your community understand how to talk to you, right? Part of working with the community is that communication that goes back and forth. And this frames those discussions so that they're not unguided, but they follow your standard patterns. Whether it be your issue templates or your contributor's guide, you're telling the community how they can communicate with you. Next, maintaining quality. How do you maintain a quality product when you can have any number of developers of any number of skill set contributing? One, you want to set expectations. Let them know what you think is quality. You can take a look, there's our issue template that we just talked about, and I call out what makes quality. One, Tell me what issue you're fixing. 2, have you done unit tests? 3, does it build? 4, does it pass unit tests? And 5, does it come with documentation? Now I apologize, I chose the worst issue to take a snapshot of that because you look, they're all marked NA because this was a spelling change on the README and didn't really need to care about all of that build. But if you touch my code, those are the things I care about. 2, automate. If there is not something I could stress harder about being in open source, it's automation. We do a huge number of automated checks that prove our quality is maintained with every pull request. Why did I do this? Because when I started out, it was basically just me reviewing pull requests and begging some of the other engineers at JPL to review and make sure we maintained quality. And pretty soon I realized, hey, I can't keep up with this. The day Ingenuity flew on Mars, I got 30 pull requests from the world who were all like, we want to be on board with this product. Here, take our contributions. And I said, I don't want to discard them, but I can't review this all. The automated checks started to save me because they check we build, they check we pass unit tests, they check we run on the hardware that we say we're going to run on, and we're starting to move into code quality checks and security analysis. All of that is done automated. That would take me a month to do on every pull request, and instead it takes 45 minutes grinding away on a cloud, and I look at the reports when it's done. This is immensely powerful when you're in open source, because one of the things we see in open sources all the time is that we do not have enough people on our community projects to be able to contend with the fullness of the community. Every open source project is understaffed. That's just the way it is. We talk about it all the time. This great project is managed by one person who works 40 hours a week and then works another 40 hours a week on the project and isn't really funded to do this. Automation helps. Automation takes that burden off. And then finally, don't forget to do your reviews. You want to continue to review as if it was developed in-house. At JPL, we review every bit of flight software that we send on our rovers, and F Prime is considered flight software, so I do a review on every pull request. It's after the automated checks, because I want the user to improve and pass those checks before I bother to review it, but I do sit down, read every line of code, try to get my team to review every line of code before we merge it in. Doesn't mean no problems ever get into F Prime, but it does mean that we cut out a substantial number of problems and we keep track of our quality and where that quality is going. Next, we talked about that multiverse problem. How do we deal with that multiverse? This is one of the things that I guessed at with F Prime and it tended to stick. It's the idea of fostering an ecosystem. If your product needs to be bigger than the one you're trying to manage, build an ecosystem around it. What F Prime did is we said, all right, we have some packages that work with F Prime, and those we will spin off into the world, and they will be of varying quality. That is, I'm not going to review every pull request that comes into these satellite repos. Some of them are managed by external teams. Some of them are managed by people that I don't even know who they work for. But the idea is they can contribute to F Prime in a way that does not add burden to me, but extends F Prime's ability to be out there in the world. Why? Because they can do plugins, or libraries, or packages, or whatever you want to call them, right? They're called many different names, but it's the idea of having an ecosystem that people can contribute to that may not be contributing directly to core, but can take that core and move it to different directions. We've also seen this in Python, right? Pip is amazing. You can install any Python package anywhere. Suddenly, Python can be an image processing system, or it can be a audiovisual processing system for a conference, right? That's not something we would bake into core Python, but we add it to layers outside as part of the ecosystem. By allowing your product to have an ecosystem built around it, you get tools, libraries, extended use cases for free, and it does not put more work on you because it's up to the larger community to take that ecosystem and guide it wherever it needs to go. And by doing it this way, F Prime is finding its way into devices and use cases and spaces that I never intended. And I'm happy to let it do that because it doesn't affect my day-to-day, which is flying spacecraft. It allows the community to take it where they need to go. So, I'm moving a little bit fast, but that's okay. We'll have time for questions. We're on to the conclusions. So, first of all, what are those takeaways again? Those takeaways are embracing community. We talked about the double-edged sword of community, and all the solutions were, hey, go run after that community. Take that double-edged sword and use it for what it's good for. Rather than running away from it, we embrace it. 2, open source everything. I said the big takeaway from this lesson was taking those management structures and dragging them open source. You should do that. Whatever your open source management structures are, whether they be issues or milestones or development plans, Gantt charts, pull them out into the open. Make sure that the community can see that. Because if you want to embrace your community, they have to know where you're taking that product and where to help you along the way. Finally, follow those standard patterns. Those standard patterns are standard for a reason, because 20 other different repositories out there were looking at how to do open source, and they kind of agreed that that was a good idea. And so if you follow those, guess what? You get all of that good idea for free. And finally, automate, 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 automate. Where you need help because you don't have enough staff or you don't have enough coverage, you can automate. Build a check, build a tool, build something that makes your product automated so that you don't have to invest effort in the turn crank side. You can invest effort in the community management side, the management structure side, or those standard patterns and building those up. So what about the future? Well, this future is about F prime. We need to release a roadmap. This is one of those management structures that we haven't released. We talked about issues, we talked about templates, we talked about development patterns and what milestones we're working on, and then I also said we're not doing this well. We need to get a roadmap out there. Why? Because the high-level roadmap, what we want to do in 5 or 10 years, is critical to our community, and that feedback I've been getting is, please release a roadmap. They want to know not what I'm doing in the next year, what I'm actually spending resources on, but where I see this going. Why? Because they want to contribute to that long-term vision. And if they don't know what we're thinking, they can't contribute to that. It's essential for our users to understand not just the short-term vision of development, but the long-term vision of where we want to see that development. We need to continue growing key members. Why? Because I showed you one key member, and we might have one other key member out there that feels really empowered to contribute to the community. We need more of those, and we need them to take a larger role in F prime's development. Why? Because I can't keep doing it all myself. If I'm to be focusing on sending out roadmaps or developing excellent software or doing all of these other pieces that we do in open source, I need community members who can stand up, offer support, offer guidance, and keep that feedback cycle we saw on the first slide moving forward. And then finally, F prime needs to keep on listening. We are listening today. The reason I said keep on listening is because it's very easy for us as open source contributors to just stop listening. To say, oh, we got that community feedback. We understand where the community is thinking and what they need. And if we don't keep up with what they're saying tomorrow, we will not be able to continue to be a dynamic, useful product for them in 2 years, 3 years, whatever it might be. You've got to keep listening, keep your ear to the ground, and see where the product is growing. That brings me to my question slide. And it looks like we have plenty of time for questions because I got through this presentation fairly quickly. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me bring you a mic. Thank you, Michael. That was so amazing.
Michael, thank you so much. That was great. A quick question. You mentioned in the beginning the fears of intellectual property release in the wild. Can you talk about that, how you guys overcame that? And then I have a second question about it.
Sure. So this is the question that I expected. What are the fears of releasing intellectual property, specifically in my world, ITAR, and how did we manage that? So for those of you who don't know, ITAR is designed to prevent weapons from leaving this country and going to another country who might use those weapons for some nefarious purpose. One of the things that is classified as weapons in this country is a satellite, right? Spacecraft. And so we have to be very careful when we're open sourcing, open sourcing spacecraft and spacecraft software to make sure we're not violating those rules. And I just talked for an hour, or well, half an hour, about a, software framework that is designed to control those spacecraft. How do we contend with those two? Well, if we look back at the slides here, one of the things I said is foster an ecosystem, right? You want to build an ecosystem. If you build your product well, part of that ecosystem is the spacecraft that you're actually flying on Mars. So we flew a helicopter on Mars. That is one of our big wins for F Prime because that's the one that hit the news and told everybody, hey, NASA is flying open source software. Not all of the helicopter software is open source. The stuff that is specific to the helicopter that might be ITAR restricted or might be restricted by intellectual property or copyright, that's spun off as one of these packages. It's part of the larger ecosystem of F Prime, but it's kept internal to JPL. The core framework, those building blocks that you could use to build a helicopter or a rover or an RV car or a robot at Girls Who Code, shout out to Girls Who Code, that is all existing. You can see it. And I point out Girls Who Code because it's a high school program that actually used F Prime. I guided them through it because I mentored there, but that was one of the cool use cases. You can see how these various use cases become part of the ecosystem, and not all of that ecosystem has to be outside your firewall. Open source the stuff that you know is intellectual property free or ITAR free. Get that out there and make sure that the community has the mechanisms to build an ecosystem. Some of it might be closed, some of it might not be. We can say the same thing on Ubuntu, right? They have a product that is open source and ready for the world, and if you're part of your community clicks the little thing that says, yes, use third-party software, they do. Now, I'm not gonna get into that debate. I know this is a Linux conference and people will get very animated about whether or not you click that button. But the idea is you have the option. And when you're dealing with things like ITAR, it is essential to have that option because otherwise we couldn't do open source at all. Does that answer your question? Okay. Are there any other questions? Yes.
So I imagine many of the users for this would be other space agencies in other countries. Could you say a little bit about where that's your community coming from versus other places? Like, are there individuals who just want to contribute to this?
So the big answer is I have no idea. I don't know who my community is because they're GitHub handles, and if you trace those GitHub handles, they go to web pages that just are kind of thin. So there's a large portion of my community that's very active that I don't know who they are. But that's okay, because again, we talked about the ecosystem and we talked about how we separated our ITAR work from the core, and that gave us the ability to release it to people that I don't have to track. Now, who are my primary users? My primary users that I know about are other universities. There are lots of universities that are getting into the CubeSat space that want to build CubeSat software, and those users are out there in the world desperately needing a leg up, because what used to be, when I was in college, if you fly a CubeSat, you're awesome, is now they're competing for NASA missions and want those CubeSats to do NASA missions. And the expectation is, yeah, you just know how to write the software, you know how to build the hardware. I think the next talk is on open hardware, so come to that one. Hopefully I didn't get that wrong. Okay, great. So those users were desperately looking for a product because the problem with university programs is they come in, and then 4 years later they graduate, and now you have this constant brain drain that's hitting them time and time and time again. So giving them a framework like F Prime, the building blocks to construct software, helps them retain some of that institutional knowledge because we bake that knowledge into the product. That's why universities love what we do, and also working with universities gave us an edge up in the market because we go to those universities that are staffed by students like my Girls Who Code team, and they come back to us with, we don't understand this. And that gives us deep insight into, well, where does the average user struggle with our product? The people who built this are aerospace engineers who have been working for a long time. They know the field, they know what to do, and they know how to work around problems. Pushing this on university students, or in my case, high school students, gives us insight into where people struggle to make a product that is easier to use for everybody. And then the other users out in the community, I have no idea who they are. They're GitHub handles, but they're very engaged. So I'll respond to them and keep them as part of their community. Because in the end, if they're helping me build a better product, that's good. And if they don't want me to know their identities, or they just don't have enough online presence for me to figure out, that's okay. Does that answer your question? Yep. Cool. Are there other questions? Back there.
Okay, so my question is, it sounds like it's a lot of work to build this community. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you mean by evangelizing within the community and what kind of effort do you put in to build this community?
Sure. So It is a lot of work to build a community. It's a very difficult thing to do because you've got this great idea, but nobody knows about it. And unless you're a very small number of people, you don't have a broadcast studio where you can just push your ideas on the airwaves. So what do you do to help the world understand your product? One, we talked about evangelizing. We go to a lot of conferences. Myself and the team that works with me at JPL, they're all out at IEEE Aerospace this week doing presentations there about various F-Prime projects. I'm here at Scale talking about F-Prime through the guise of management, but you're all hearing about us. So getting out to those conferences helps people who are in the same space, whether it be open source or whether it be aerospace, understand about your product. We also worked very heavily to talk with student programs and figure out which student programs desperately needed our software. Some student programs have their own software, they have a good team, and they've moved it forward. Other programs were suffering. Those suffering programs, we reached out to and said, hey, can you use our product? Then we started providing training classes. We have a workshop that we do every year, and that brings in people from both JPL and the university space into JPL, and we teach them about not just F-Prime, but how we do F-Prime, how we do flight software using F-Prime as an example. Just like we saw in this talk, where this talk is about open management, but we keep harping back to this product, we do the same thing in that class. We teach them how to write flight software, and our sample product is F-Prime. By doing these things, we help them get through that initial learning curve, and then once they're through these efforts, whether it's a workshop or a talk, then we let them join our open source community where we help build them up there through discussions, through support, all of those things. Does that make sense? Any other questions?
Other side of the room.
Hi, thanks, Michael. I was curious if using a contributor license agreement was considered, and what were the reasons whether or not to use one?
Oh boy, that question. Okay, so the question is a what is a contributor license agreement? Why might you use one, and why might you not use one? And I'm not the best person to answer that question because right now our team at JPL is discussing this question and the larger question of copyright. When you write something, you own that copyright. When you send it to me, you still own that copyright. I don't just get the copyright. If you contribute to the Apache Software Foundation, they make you sign a paper before you send any commits in that says, I give you my copyright. You now own the copyright to my code. And the question is, does everybody have to do this? Does everybody not have to do this? I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. What perspective did we take? We took the perspective currently that F-Prime is an open source project. We have a clear license. And so as long as we maintain this license and don't try to relicense our product, we have an implicit agreement with the contributors that their code coming in is going to be licensed under the license we've published, and therefore we don't have to have them sign code. Now, there is a big question of what happens when you want to change your license. F-Prime is likely never going to change their license, but that's when you run into trouble. If the user has contributed code to you, then if you go off and change the license, you're now changing that agreement, right? They submitted code to you and you could say, yes, they put it in, they knew what the license was, they knew what they were doing. But if you change the license at some point down the future, then you either have to have ownership of their copyright, or you have to go out there and track down everybody and say, hey, we are relicensing this product, and you might have to pull their code back out. Now, I'm not an expert. I don't pretend to be an expert. I'm telling you the ways we've looked at this problem and thought about it, but I'm also telling you we don't have the clearest of answers there. The only thing I know for sure is we're not going to attempt to relicense our product because that would be very difficult. We're pretty sure in that case we'd have to track everybody down. Oh, is there another question?
Yeah, continuing on with the licensing discussion, right? Why Apache?
Why the Apache license? That's a good question. So there are many licenses out there, right? This is a Linux conference. It's a bad place to discuss licenses because everybody has an opinion. If we use the GPL license, that would fall pretty hard on us because then you would have to make modifications and send them back, right? GPL says if you make modifications to the source code, you're required to contribute them back. If you do that in the sphere where ITAR is involved, suddenly you're forced to send requirements back that might break ITAR, right? If people want to change the core product and not just parts of the ecosystem, and they want to do it inside their own firewalls, whether it be at JPL or somewhere else, I don't want them to feel like they have to contribute back. So, did you have a comment on that? Yeah, I did, actually. Yeah.
Well, we have a question here.
I think this is part of the licensing discussion.
As a guy that does open source hardware in aerospace and has had to choose licenses and things like that, you really have to go with things that in Creative Commons speak are CC BY, not, CC BY attribution only, right? You really, because what happens is these aerospace companies won't touch things that have a share alike clause,
Yeah.
right? Again, borrowing from CC for a moment from Creative Commons, because they are deathly afraid of having to open source their stuff that is their bread and butter. You can barely get the open source stuff you made into their doors, but if it looks at all like it might take their stuff back out, they're not even going to touch it with a 100-foot pole, let alone a 10. So BSD or Apache is pretty much the only way, and CC attribution only.
Right, so if you don't mind, I'm going to elaborate on a little bit of those terms for people who are newer. We're talking about two types of licenses. There's the share-alike, or I think it's also called the copyleft style license. That's the GPL. That says if you modify my product, you are required to give me those changes. It's great for open source because people can't change your product and then not share back. But it also has this problem that if somebody wants to use your product and change it, like inside a corporate firewall, they will be required to send stuff back, and most corporations don't want to touch that because there's intellectual property or ITAR or something else. I wouldn't want to touch it in my job because guess what? If I change something in your product, then suddenly you're pulling my potentially ITAR code out, and now I'm, dancing on a bed of hot coals. So you're looking at what's known as the, I think you said the attribution only style licenses. So attribution only style licenses say you're allowed to use our product. If you make changes, you have to make sure that we're referenced in the documentation essentially. So if you take F prime and modify it, great, you're allowed to do that. Make sure that the Caltech copyright is still on there so that people know that we started the product. That's much better because people can use it more freely because they don't have this need to contribute back. And by better, I mean better for this kind of sphere where we're dealing with these other problems. I don't want to say one is better than the other for general open source, but in the aerospace world, especially when you're dealing with big companies and ITAR, having this attribution only makes it more flexible. Now, why specifically Apache and not BSD or MIT, which are the other two big licenses in this sphere? Because we have a group that helps us with open source at JPL, and they're big proponents of the Apache Software Foundation, so we just use that license. And it has some extra stuff in it about patent protections. But, say again? Explicit patent grant. But I never really quite understood what that meant, so. All right, I had other questions. Go ahead.
How do you deal with the contribution that, despite being interesting, would go against maybe the needs of the GPL?
How do we deal with contribution? Well, we're on the right slide for that. So there's a lot of contributions out there. Some are against the needs of JPL, maybe. Sometimes they're with the needs of JPL. How do we deal with that? Well, one way we dealt with that was ecosystem. We started spinning off these packages. There were people me, who wanted to run F prime on Arduinos. Arduinos are not flight hardware. If I push that into the core space, Arduino would be a bad idea because it's this other framework that we're trying to bolt F prime on and be a lot of extra code that nobody wants to put on their real spacecraft. And so I built it as an open source package. And looking at that model, we realized we could have other people who want to do things that aren't directly in line with JPL in these extra packages that don't affect our goals, but allow them to use our product. Turns out somebody did want to fly my Arduino package because they have a much smaller CubeSat than I ever imagined was possible, and they started shipping it on their product. So now we have an ecosystem that's founding on an idea that's contrary to what JPL wants to do, but allows them to extend the product anyway, while keeping the core sound. And so we've started to pull out a lot of different design packages, even ones that JPL wants, into these extra repos, so that it's not just what JPL wants, but it's what, a core plus whatever add-ons you want, and we at JPL might be those add-ons. Another thing is, sometimes we swallow the hard pill and just accept the contribution even if it's against our interests. The best example I have of that is spell checking. Some guy came in from Canada and said, use my spell checking package on your pull requests. Oh my word. Everybody at JPL was horrified. I'm an engineer, I can't spell. They're engineers, they can actually spell because my colleagues are top notch, but sometimes they get zinged by a word that isn't in the dictionary. This irritated everybody. But I said we're going to accept this because mostly I wanted contributions from this guy in Canada. So we pushed through, we got it in, we swallowed the hard pill, we adopted our project way of interacting with our project internally, and now we have a system that has cut down the number of, hey, I'm fixing this typo pull requests to nearly zero. We had hundreds of fix this spelling mistake, and now it's about zero, because this spell check was a good idea. It was contrary to our interests initially, but after discussions and thinking about it, we realized, no, it really could be on our path forward if we change a little bit. And so it's kind of that line. Do you spin it off, or do you change and deviate course a little bit for a better product? Does that make sense? I have yet to run into the scenario where somebody tries to contribute something where I just have to say no. And I'm hoping we can avoid that for longer. That might happen. The 1 or 2 times I've said no is because somebody tried to contribute to a branch that breaks our development model. They try to send a pull request at master, but right now we merge all pull requests at devel and then release master. And I just tell them, no, we'll push this into devel instead, and usually that's me clicking a button, but sometimes it's them reauthoring the pull request. Does that answer your question? I know it's not the most complete answer, because we kind of completely disregarded the, I don't like this, it's against our thought side, but we just haven't had to cross that bridge because the other 2 pieces work so well, or at least have worked so well this far. Are there other questions, other things you'd like to talk about?
If I could just make a slight correction on the GPL, it only requires you to contribute your contributions back if you distribute the software in binary form to a third party.
Okay.
If you make your changes and they're internal to your organization or to yourself, you're not required to contribute your contributions back.
That's good to know.
That would count shipping a satellite that you sold to the government. If I sold a satellite to a government
Yeah.
and they went to go fly it, and I had GPL code on it, and I added to it, now my code is GPL as well. You're right, absolutely.
Yeah, so let me state this out a little bit because it didn't get caught on the microphone feed. So the statement was, you're only required to give your changes back if you've shipped your code with modifications to a third party. And then the other comment was, that would count if you're selling your embedded system with running code to a third party like the government. The point I would make here is I've had this argument with many people at JPL, and there's a lot of confusion around it as to exactly what these lines mean, because we're, let's face it, very deep in the gray space of licenses, and most of us don't have the deepest understanding of licenses. So we tend to look at the MIT style, because that's the first one I ran into, simply because it's just easier to think about. But you are absolutely right in that is the caveat about the GPL licenses. For those people who are really interested, I encourage you to look up and read the licenses, and on some of those websites that give you the takeaways, they're much easier to understand, and I don't profess to be an expert on licenses. But these are good points, and this is an important discussion to have. Any other questions, things you'd like to talk about? We got a few more minutes here, and then there's the hallway track, so we can chat a little bit longer if you want to hang around. Or if you're ready to go, feel free to leave. Yes?
You mentioned,
Just, I'll repeat the question into the feed, so if you just want to.
I was going to say, you mentioned that people are taking F prime and doing things that you never expected with it. What's the most unexpected project you've heard about with F prime?
So the question is, what is the most unexpected project I've heard of with F prime and the things people are doing with it? So I guess it's one of my projects, actually. I was talking about the Arduino project, right? And mostly I just wanted to see if I could get F prime to run on an Arduino. Not the real Arduinos, but the boards in the Arduino framework that have a little bit more power. And I did that at my desk at home. And then I put it out into the community and said, all right, there's this bare metal package that you can run on Arduino. And then I had like 4 different customers from both internal to JPL and external to JPL who were like, I'm going to ship this thing to space. And I said, wait, I built this over a weekend just to see if I could, and suddenly this thing has taken legs and everybody wants it. And almost all of my new customers talk about it in some way. Is this possible? Can we use this? Can we ship this? That was unexpected to me. I probably should have seen it coming, but I didn't. And then another package we built, another customer was like, hey, I want to run Python, but I want to mount it to F prime. And so we looked at building a Python bridge, and now I don't think it's in the community. I think it might be under my GitHub repo, but there's a bridge from F prime to Python, which I would never have expected. We've had the university ship ultra small spacecraft so that they're operating in less RAM than I can fill a string with on my normal spacecraft. And they're like, we're going to do this. And they're building on some of those Arduino pieces. All of these things are unexpected. In fact, most of what people do outside of JPL is unexpected because they have different constraints. They want to run on a different OS than we choose. They want to run on different hardware than we choose. We kind of expected those 2 things, but some of these extensions where they want to do it with students, or there's a group out there in Alabama who's like, we want to work with F prime, but we want to do the giant project management schema development thing that generates F prime for us. I didn't expect that one either, where they're like, hey, we're going to write these design files that generate documentation and spacecraft and software and modeling files. And I'm like, okay, that's awesome. Way more than I can think about, but those people are excellent. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
Anyway, speaking of use cases that are not part of the core library, but spin up a kind of a life of their own, when do you give those use cases a little bit more attention just because so many community members are interested, and or when can we expect F prime 3 on your Arduino fork?
Okay, so that's an excellent question. There are 2 pieces there. When do things get more attention? And 2, when can you expect Arduino 3 on my fork? So, or F prime 3 on my Arduino fork. So, 1, when do things get more attention? Well, from me specifically, it typically comes to the JPL use cases, the parts of the ecosystem that JPL needs. Why? Because that's my direct funding source, and I answer to my boss. That being said, other parts of the community get direct feedback from some of these members outside, and they manage those pieces. So you can see like the free RTOS fork is being bounced around between a customer in Australia and a customer on the East Coast, and they're working to get free RTOS up. That has a lot more visibility than some of our projects because there are 2 different members of the community there, and basically if they came to us and said, we want to work on this, and we said, here, it's under F prime community, but here's a repo, go to town. Now, specifically, when can you see F prime on my Arduino fork? Go look up Sterling Pete, his Arduino fork. That has a branch that is working towards Arduino 3. So that will be merged back into the F prime formal Arduino fork once we've got it tested on more than just a single board, but it exists out there already as the 2 of us are collaborating on it kind of over weekends and stuff. Does that answer your question? So the best way to do that is if you start posting discussions and or just state in one of our discussions tabs, hey, I want to do this. And then we work pretty hard to get you on the right list there. Does that answer your question? Cool. We're out of time. There's a half an hour between talks, right? So I'm going to shut off the microphone now so that the people upstairs don't have to keep worrying about it. But if you have other questions, come up here and we'll chat for a little bit. Thank you all for your time.
Thank you, everybody.
I hope you
Big
got
round of
something
applause.
useful out of this talk.